Hello and welcome back to Round the Table, slow TV radio from the meeting point, broadcasting not only to Bilbao but throughout the world. And in today's programme we are discussing the concept of Utopia. We have our celebrity guest speaker coming up with one of his fascinating monologues, and then I'll be going through some of the ideas that we've been discussing in class this week. We've got a few pronunciation problems that I've noticed this week, and then we'll be looking at the differences in language between not only America and the UK, but also between different class groups within the UK. So to begin with, here is our celebrity guest speaker.
For as long as people have lived together, they have dreamed of a better world, a place where everyone is safe, equal, and free. This dream has a name: Utopia. The word means both good place and no place, suggesting that while we can imagine perfection, we may never truly reach it. Still, the idea continues to inspire writers, thinkers, and ordinary people who believe that society can, and should, be improved. Imagine waking up in a city that feels perfectly balanced. Clean air flows through quiet streets lined with trees and gardens. Every building has green roofs and solar panels. Public transport is free and efficient. There are no traffic jams, no noise, no pollution. Parks and rivers are full of life. Children playing, people of all ages exercising, reading, and talking. Every citizen has access to good health care, education, and housing. Nobody is left behind, because the system is designed to care for everyone, not just a lucky few. In this utopian city, people work fewer hours and spend more time doing things that give them purpose. Art, science, and community projects are at the heart of life. Technology supports human well-being rather than replacing it. Robots do the repetitive work. Humans focus on creativity and connection. Decisions are made collectively, with transparency and respect. There is no competition for survival, only cooperation for improvement. But even in this perfect world, questions remain. Would people still feel motivated if there were no personal challenges or ambitions? Would individuality disappear if everyone lived under the same ideal system? And who decides what perfect really means? History has shown that when one group tries to impose its vision of paradise on others, freedom can quickly vanish. Utopias built on control often turn into dystopias. Societies where peace is achieved at the cost of diversity and choice. Perhaps the true value of imagining a utopia lies not in reaching it, but in the process of trying. By picturing a fairer, greener, more compassionate world, we reveal what we most care about. We may never build the perfect city, but we can make our own cities cleaner, kinder, and more human. Every step toward that vision, however small, brings us closer to the kind of world we once could only imagine.
Thank you for that very interesting monologue there. And now let's look at some of the ideas that came up in the conversations this week. The first question in the book, or the first statement in the book, was inequality is inevitable in any political system or in any society. So we looked at inequality and what it means, and really what is equality. We came to the conclusion that equality can be looked at in different ways. What we do need is the equality of opportunity and the equality of rights. But we don't necessarily want everybody to be exactly equal. Maybe a certain amount of inequality would be necessary in order to motivate people, to stimulate economies and to make people inventive, to start businesses, to progress and to study. If everybody's job was paid exactly the same, there would be no need for anyone to further themselves and study things. So we figured that a bit of inequality would be good, because if you have the opportunity to have a better house or a bigger car, it might be, well, not such a negative thing. The big problem is the level of inequality. This is the conclusion we came to. We need to limit the level of inequality. The second question was whether we should have a cap on wealth. And when I say a cap on wealth, I mean a limit. If we should have a limit on how rich people should be. And the conclusion was that in theory it would be a good idea, but in all practicality it's not really going to happen. And then we discussed the idea of limiting how much could be inherited. So when someone gets near the end of their life, they need to be spending their money quickly because it can't be left to their family. But then the concern was that anybody that would implement such a rule would probably not want to do it if they were in that position, because generally speaking, the people who make the rules are the people with the money. So we couldn't see how that would actually happen. Another idea on the list, on which everybody I think agreed, was that fines should be related to income, because, for example, a $50 fine isn't the same for everybody. It wouldn't have the same effect. For some people, $50 might just be small change, but to another person, $50 might be the difference of being able to feed your family or not. And indeed, we heard some examples of countries like Switzerland and Norway where this kind of idea has already been implemented. So we thought we'll bring that in, and that will be in our People's Manifesto for when we take over power in the near future, hopefully. We were also discussing free food in society. We were talking about if we should have school breakfast clubs, so some children coming to school who have not had the opportunity to eat before coming to school would have a breakfast of some sort when they arrived, because if you're hungry you cannot study, and a child with no breakfast will not learn anything in school. So we thought that was a good idea. Indeed, some people thought it might already happen in some schools. And then we were talking about school dinners, and yes, they are called school dinners. The money you take to buy your dinner is called your dinner money, and the women that serve the meals are called dinner ladies, and I'll come back to that in the near future. So we were talking about if kids should have free school dinners, and in some places the less advantaged children do indeed get school dinners for nothing. And then we were talking about the idea of the food banks that exist, where you can buy food in the supermarket and give it to a charity organisation, and they distribute it to the people who need food. We thought if that idea was done on a local government level, it would be cheaper for the government to buy several hundred kilos of lentils rather than individuals buying it by the kilo from the supermarket, which only adds to the profit of the supermarket. If it could be a government organisation, we could quite easily set up cheap restaurants selling reasonably priced, reasonable value food. Nothing too fancy, because we don't want any competition with the real restaurants, but just to make sure that everybody has the possibility to get their hands on at least one cooked dish every day. It's not beyond the means of the local council, I don't think. So we kind of like that idea of sort of state-run restaurants. Then we got on to education and some of the things that young people might need to be learning to prepare themselves for this changing world. And as well as nutrition and cooking and things like that, which we've discussed before, we went on to talk about the idea of learning rational thinking, how to process arguments, how to get your message across to other people, and how to interact. This might be something that people are missing these days. We also looked at media literacy, how to understand what the media is telling you, how to read between the lines. That's the phrase, to read between the lines. What do they really mean? What message are they trying to get across to you? And what is their motivation for trying to get the message to you? And how trustworthy that message might be. These are important things that people need to know, because a lot of people will take the information at face value rather than analysing the motivations behind the message and why people are trying to convince you of something. There was another question there on whether religion has had a positive effect on society. We didn't actually discuss that this week, so maybe in the next book we might have a topic called Taboo Subjects. Some of the groups managed to get onto the next page where we discussed political parties and politicians. We did not discuss politics. No, that leads to arguments, so we don't do that. But we discussed political parties and politicians and their role and how they should be trusted or not trusted. Would you respect a politician who changed their position according to public opinion, or one that sticks to their beliefs? And should a politician have to toe the party line, meaning conform to the party's policies? There then followed a lengthy discussion on what aspects of society should be government controlled and government run, and which would be better in the private sector. Because I think that everybody has a level of socialist within them. I don't think anybody would deny that free education for all children would be a good thing. And for most European people, for us, we would consider free healthcare a fundamental of a modern society, whereas some people in the United States might think it's a bit close to communism or something. But for us it would be a fundamental. And we were talking about privatization of electricity companies, water companies, that kind of thing. In the Friday afternoon group, we spent a lot of time talking about Bilbao and why Bilbao is such a wonderful place to live. We were talking about what makes a good place to live. So we were talking about public safety, we were talking about transport systems, traffic congestion, the need for open spaces and parks and sports facilities, and the fact that many things are within walking distance, which means you have a lot of communication, much more communication with the neighbours than you might get in some other societies. We were talking about people from the United States that we know that have been to Spain or other European cities and are surprised by how easy it is to get around. You don't necessarily need a car. And if you are in a car-based society, you don't have that much contact with the people around you. So we were talking about that and how fundamental that is, in our opinion at least, of what makes a better society. So that was just some of the things that came up in conversation this week. Another thing that came up, which was totally off topic, was a discussion on biscuits. This was Tuesday's group. We were discussing biscuits for the first half an hour, and I've got some interesting facts for you. We were talking about biscuits, and then we got on to the idea of the gingerbread man. This character here is called a gingerbread man. It's a sort of a ginger biscuit. It's not a bread at all. It's a biscuit in the form of a little human, and we wondered why, how this might have come about, why it's always in the shape of a man, and why they're always a ginger flavour. Well, I did some research, and I found out that it goes back to Tudor times, as we call it in English history, which is sort of 16th century, when spices were quite an exotic thing, and if you were an aristocrat or even a monarch, you would demonstrate your wealth by showing your visitors your range of spicy food that you had available, and ginger was a very popular spice amongst the wealthy people. They also liked to make little cakes and biscuits in the shape of animals. This was very common. And they would make a wooden mould and press into it breadcrumbs and ginger and egg and make these little biscuit things in the shape of animals. And then they would also do religious figures. They would do saints and things like that, made out of this little biscuit stuff. And then, around the time of, I believe, Elizabeth I, she thought it would be rather entertaining when she had visitors coming, diplomats and people like that would come to court and eat in the presence of Her Majesty. She would present them with these little cakes and biscuits that looked like themselves. They had these little characters that represented various diplomats from different royal courts, etc. And over the years, these little figures just got stylized into the modern gingerbread man. So it's a thing that goes back to Tudor times. Another biscuit we were looking at was the Garibaldis. We were discussing Garibaldi biscuits, which in England are commonly known as squashed fly biscuits. Now, I thought it was just my father that called them squashed fly biscuits to stop us eating them, because these little currants inside look like squashed flies. Now, the history of these goes back to 1861. They were invented by the Peak-Friens Biscuit Company, and it's because Garibaldi, the Italian revolutionary, I believe he was, and I think he unified Italy into the modern state that it is. And he visited England. He was very, very popular in the middle of the 19th century. And in honour of one of his visits to the United Kingdom, they named this biscuit after him. It was probably just a publicity thing to sell more biscuits, to cash in on his popularity. But there you go, the Garibaldi biscuit was born. It's a very interesting biscuit because it's not crunchy at all. And of course, a biscuit really should be crunchy because biscuit comes from the Italian biscotti, which means it is cooked twice. And that is why they should be crunchy, because if they're not crunchy, I think it's a cookie. Which brings us on to another subject, which I think is quite interesting. You may have heard that in England we have biscuits, whereas in America they have cookies. A lot of people think that sometimes we have different words for things. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. We have the same words, but for different things. Because in England we also have cookies, But to me, a cookie is bigger than a biscuit, and it's not as crunchy. They're softer and they're bigger, and they're called cookies. In America, they also have biscuits, but they're not the same as biscuits in England. It's more of a savoury thing. It's like a hard bread type thing. I don't really know about this. I imagine it's something like what we would call cobblers, but they're quite a hard bready thing, and you have it with a savoury dish. So one thing you can buy in New York, I never tasted it, but I saw it on sale, chicken and biscuits. Now, to a European person, that might sound strange because you're thinking of a sweet biscuit, but it's not a sweet biscuit. It's a savoury thing. So, yes, we do have cookies in the UK, and yes, they do have biscuits in the United States, but they're different things. Another very complicated thing that we were talking about was chips and fries. Now, let me go through this slowly. If you buy a bag of fried potatoes, which are cold and crispy with salt on, or other flavourings, I call them crisps. Okay? In America, they call them chips. In the UK, if you fry pieces of potato and you eat them hot with fried eggs and with bacon and things like that, or fish, we call them chips. In America, those are fries or French fries. Okay? Now, when I was young, we didn't call chips French fries because we had another thing that was called French fries, and that was potato that was already cooked, like boiled potato that was left from a previous meal, and then you would refry it. It's very different from if you fry raw potato. The potato that's already cooked makes it quite a different thing from a chip. Those we called French fries. And if I remember rightly, in America, they're called home fries. So again, it gets very complicated. Back to the other interesting thing that I mentioned earlier. Dinners, school dinners. Now, I mentioned this in class this week, and everyone said, but dinner in the middle of the day, surely it's called school lunch. And I said, no. It was always called school dinner. The word lunch did not exist in my vocabulary when I was a child, because more upper class people tend to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner is the evening meal. For more working class people, you'd have breakfast, dinner, and the evening meal is called tea. Okay, it's called tea. There is no tea drinking involved. It's a meal. You eat your tea. Okay? There is no tea at tea time. It's a common myth. But it's a class distinction. We have different names for different meals. Now, I suppose originally there was tea involved in tea. If you watch films set in England, and they're usually set 100 years ago, these upper class people, they drink tea in the afternoon, yeah? That's because they had their main meal a lot later in the day. Those people you're seeing do not work. They do not do anything, okay? They have servants to prepare meals, and their servants bring them tea, okay? But for working people, you get home from work, you get home from school, you say to your mother, "What's for tea, ma'am?" And it means, what are we eating? There is no tea involved at tea time for the majority of people. So, dinner ladies serve school dinners, and you pay for it with your dinner money. And I also explained that the majority of people do not have a sofa. No, we have a settee. There's a word you've never heard before. A settee is another word for sofa, but only posh people have sofas. The majority of people sit on a settee. In the living room or in the sitting room? Or is it the lounge? Or is it the front room? Depends where you live, depends on your social class. We have different names for different things. The problem is that your English book that you study, or indeed the films that you watch, which are set in England, often represent a very small group of people. They don't show the whole picture, so there's quite a lot of British culture that you won't know about until you get there. We don't always agree on language. And in today's pronunciation problems, we need to look at the letters M, B, D, and G. Normally, people have no difficulty in pronouncing these sounds. M, B, D, G. The problem is that these sounds very rarely appear at the end of a word in Spanish. You don't have words that end in these sounds. So if the sound is at the beginning of the word, it's not problematic. When it's at the end of the word, it creates a lot more problems. So let's look at this. The favourite one, the word gym, is easily confused with the word gin. Gym, gin. Often I hear people talking about going to the gin after work, which is not what you're trying to say, I don't think. Also, the word screen, as in looking at the computer screen, often sounds like scream. So this N and M sound often get mixed up. The next one is the B, the B. People don't have a problem when it's at the beginning, but when you get it at the end of a word, people seem to pronounce a sort of an F type sound, like pub, pub. You hear the B on the end, pub. It's not puff. Don't do that puff thing. Pub. And a word like globe, globe. People say something a bit like glove. Globe. And of course, the D at the end. When you have a D in Spanish, when it's at the end, you often say something like in Madrid, you do that th thing at the end. Valladolid. Of course, in English, it's very, very important that you can do the D at the end because that's how we make a past tense. Okay? So make sure you learn how to say a D on the end of a word like dead, for example. It's not the same as debt, and it's not the same as death. It's dead with a D on the end. And the final one to look out for is the G on the end. People often do a throat sound, this sort of noise. People say egg and dog instead of egg and dog. Okay, so there's 4 sounds there that in English they often appear at the end of a word, and they very rarely appear at the end of a word in Spanish. Or if they do, like the D, you've got a different pronunciation for it at the end of the word. Whereas if it's at the beginning of the word, you would do the same pronunciation as us. So that D never changes in English. Whether it's at the beginning, the middle, or the end, it will always be a D. So those are the 4 sounds to focus on. M, B, D, and G at the end of a word. Concentrate on that. I'll be testing you next week. And finally, here is the news. On Friday evening we had the first of our Great Bilbao Architecture quizzes held in the office. We had 9 people came to participate, some of which we hadn't seen for a while because they are sort of ex-members or people that are temporarily away from their normal group, but they are going to return soon in January, no doubt. But very nice to see everybody back together again and good to meet different people from different groups. We had a few beers and a bottle of wine and some wonderful cheese, of course. And we looked at images of buildings, signs, statues around Bilbao. And it was very successful indeed. We will be having a repeat of the same event on the 7th in 2 weeks' time for those that were not able to attend last night's little quiz. And of course, coming up on the 21st of November, we'll be looking at the short story Desiree's baby. So we'll be having a meeting for anybody who's interested in discussing a small piece of English literature. So get your names down now and write that date in your diary. That will be after 6 o'clock on the 21st of November. Hope to see you then. And that's all we have time for today. So have a good week. Till next week.